Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for attending our webinar on enterprise risk management. I think we have enough attendee to start. So let's start the webinar now. Maybe Marika, you can go to the next slide. So today we are three to cover this topic. So I introduce myself. I am Gregory Marchard. I am partner in the UK and I lead our UK financial services practice. And today with me, we have Anindya and Brida, who are both director and associate director in our risk consulting practice, who have a lot of experience with regulatory issues and risk management. Next slide. So what we are going to cover, a short introduction on ERM. We'll then cover what are the common theme and expectation, what are the key area of risk management, what are the key themes also that are getting out of the section 166, which highlight when companies are failing in their risk management practice. We will discuss also how to do an enterprise risk maturity assessment. And we will focus on one area around risk culture. You can see we have a Q&A at the end. The Q&A is open, so don't hesitate to ask your question during the webinar, and we will answer everything at the end. This seminar is recorded, and we will also have, I think, two poll during the presentation, so you please participate to the poll to have a good picture of what everyone is doing. So without further ado, maybe let's start, Narika, to the next slide. So a short introduction on what is ERM. I'm sure you are all familiar with ERM, but maybe it's always worth a short reminder. ERM basically something that guides businesses to identify, assess, manage, and report risks. It's really important to have that in place. And it's not designed just to bother the firm, but it's actually designed to support the growth, but also to protect excessive losses and prevent detriment to customer. So it's really critical in any company management. Obviously, the framework is made of many different processes, systems, and tools, and they are all used to manage risk and ensure the firm remains within its defined risk appetite. What is important, and we talk about that at the end, is the tone from the top. It is driven by the board. The board gives the direction, and they need to show how all of that is put in place. But it is important to have also a bottom-up approach to challenge the risk management. So it is supported by a strong risk culture, and it empowers people and individuals to make appropriate and informed risk-based decisions at all levels of.
Gregory, I think you've gone on mute.
Sorry, I probably touched my keyboard. Thank you, Anindya. So what you see on this slide is also a graph. You have the key element of the risk management, enterprise risk management. What is important is to see the cycle. It's obviously not a one-off. ERM is informed by many processes and needs to be reviewed every year, at least. So every step has to be reviewed and be updated with what is discovered during the year. So it's not a one-off, as I said. It can only improve with time, and we will cover other elements now. So I hand over now to Brida.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So what are the principles and the expectations of enterprise risk management? So we know that there are specific risk management techniques that exist for every risk type. So a few are the market risk, operational risk, and liquidity risk. But it is important to have an overarching approach and for ERM to span the entire universe of risks. So whilst regulations are less prescriptive on ERM, expectations are still clear. The PRA and the FCA have communicated fundamental rules and principles for businesses. So if we look at the PRA, some that can be aligned to the expectations of businesses in relation to ERM are the Fundamental Rule 2. So this is where a firm must conduct its business with due skill, care, and diligence. Fundamental Rule 5, so a firm must have effective risk strategies and risk management systems. Fundamental Rule 6, so a firm must organise and control its affairs responsibly and effectively. And Fundamental Rule 7, so a firm must deal with its regulators in an open and cooperative way. So we have an example which we will run through shortly, which highlights a failure of the Fundamental Rule 7 that has led to a fine for a firm. So your firm needs to ensure that you've assessed your framework and the business processes and how they align to the regulator's fundamental rules. So further to this, the PRA Supervisory Statement 516, which is corporate governance board responsibilities, have also set out expectations for firms. So we've taken the information in there and we've tried to make this more practical for ERM. So these are the bullet points that you see on the slide. So we've got risk governance and culture, so set and promoted from the top. This is key. We'll be discussing this more later on. ERM also needs to be integrated with the strategy and embedded within the organisation and its activities. It needs to be applied using structured and consistent approach to all risks across the organisation, and it also needs to be proportionate to the business and risks it faces. The regulator mentions this significantly, that proportionality is key to ensure effective management. There should be transparency and openness to challenge new ideas, and also timely and accurate reporting. So this will ensure key communication on risks from the business to the management and the board. And as Gregory has mentioned, this should be reviewed on an ongoing basis. So the next slide is on common issues and themes. But first, we'd really like to hear from you on what the biggest issues currently are for your firm and enterprise risk management. So there will be a poll, and if you could just select one, that would be great. We'll just give everyone a minute to vote. Okay, and then if we can move to the next slide. Okay, resource constraints and very high for resource constraints and lack of system to monitor and manage risk management. Okay, brilliant. If we could go to the next slide. So what we've put on here, is the common themes and expectations, but the common issues that we've heard from banks and other firms. So resource constraints. So this is really key, and I think that this is definitely what we're hearing from all the firms. So the firms are really struggling. So not only with the Great Resignation, that is a fallout from the pandemic, but especially for small to medium-sized firms. So there can be a struggle to retain that key talent. And this also links to one of the boxes that we've got, which is the insufficient resources to undertake risk activities. So this is a key impact from those resource constraints. So this can be within the risk team or within the firm, and then teams may not prioritize risk management because there's an increased workload. So we must note here that every employee is accountable for their own risk management within the day-to-day role, but it is a struggle that we're seeing across the board for most firms. Also, the lack of system to monitor and manage risk management. So this can also link to the resource constraints, but it can cause frustrations throughout the firm. The second line, they want to be able to easily review and manage risk in one place and report it efficiently. And also management, heads of departments, they want to be able to monitor the risks within their team. But to do this, it requires investment, not just financial, but also, again, going back to the resources. So it can also have an impact on that. And some of the others we can look at. So there is the lack of understanding of roles and responsibilities where they haven't been clearly defined. So a key question that we're hearing is, what am I responsible for as a first line and a second line function? So firms need to be clear on the communication from the top. So it needs to be consistent. What is the first line responsible for, and the second line, and the third line? There are many instances where this can be blurred, and this is the key point where the business should be consistent in their approach of how to resolve this. So this ensures that people are aware of what they should be doing at all times. Another one we could look at is ERM does not evolve with the business. So here we mean that a lot of firms will put in place a risk management framework. So they'll have their KRIs, their risk appetite, their policies done, and they will review that on an annual basis. So everything should be okay. But things change. To quote part of Basel's definition of operational risk, this can be people, processes, systems, and external events. So the ERM assessment requires a holistic overview of really assessing where the firm's enterprise risk management sits compared to where you want it to sit. There's also ineffective risk event management. So we're all aware that incidents, issues, risk events, near misses, whichever terminology is used within the firm, can happen every day. But embedding a strong and open framework that ensures robust management of risk events can really impact potential resources, reoccurrence of events, or prevent the next one, which could be costly for the firm. So you need to ensure you communicate effectively risk events to management and the board. So has the root cause analysis been done effectively? If not, this may mean that the risk mitigation strategies will not work. When you do put in place controls, how do you ensure that they are robust enough to mitigate the level of risk? This is where you need to test controls on a regular basis. So these are a few common issues and themes that we've seen or we've discussed with clients. I'm sure we could go through a lot more, but let's just stop there and we can just move to the next slide, please. And I'll hand over to Anindya.
Thank you, Breda. That's very kind of you. So to introduce this slide, what I wanted to start with is by saying that there is a very common misconception in the market right now. And that common misconception is that the PRA is most focused on compliance with regulatory metrics, or indeed meeting your capital requirements, meeting your liquidity requirements, so on and so forth. Now, this statement is only partly correct. And it's partly correct because, yes, they are concerned about it, but they're also concerned about many other things that are less tangible and less specific as compliance with capital and liquidity requirements. And one of those is risk management frameworks. As you can see from the left-hand side of the slide, the majority of Section 166s that were commissioned between December 2021 and November 2022 was on risk management, was on risk management framework and controls. You must have heard firms, or indeed maybe it's your firm who is currently required to comply with some risk management and governance scalar, and that scalar, that top up in capital requirements or liquidity requirements, would have originated for no other reason other than perhaps the firm's weaknesses in risk management, in managing its own risk. So given that the PRA follows a very judgment-based supervisory approach, it's very important that firms look into their risk management capabilities and ensure that despite risk management being a lot more subjective than the numerical counterparts of capital and liquidity measurement, that the risk management frameworks and the risk management capabilities are on point. The phase one of the PRA Section 166s have focused on governance, focused on delineation between the three lines, and have focused on firms' capabilities to manage risk in an appropriate manner. And phase two will look into the embeddedness of the firm's capabilities and policies and procedures in their modus operandi. So with that in mind, it is important that the firms consider, what does good look like for the profile of risks that they are exposed to? How is performance in risk management measured? How is this performance monitored? How is it tracked? How is it reported? And how is that performance improved? So it's very important for firms to look into their organization and think about how they're doing in the context of managing its own risks, and to what extent would they find themselves in an appropriate position to demonstrate that to the PRA or indeed their boards if and when the opportunity or the requirement arises. Moving on to the next slide, Anna Erica, there are a couple of areas that I'd like to take your attention to right off the bat. So first of all, I'd like to take your attention to the top row, which outlines the different firms that have been subject to Section 166s. And as you can see very well, that the size of the firm, which is often analogous to the systemic importance of the firm in the PRA supervisory context, is not a barrier to the PRA deciding as to whether a Section 166 should apply to you. Across the top, there are firms of different sizes. Of course, there are some of the bigger firms, but also there are some of the smaller firms. So it's very important to note that the PRA will look into your firm as well. And given that you're a small firm or a medium-sized firm, would just not matter. The second area that I draw your attention to is the line right at the bottom, which outlines the quantum of the fines that these firms have had to pay. As you can see, the fines are quite massive. And this is just the monetary fine that the firms have had to pay. This does not, account for the time and the effort and the energy that the firm themselves would have had to put in to liaise with the PRA, to go through, the Section 166 review, so on and so forth. So there is a lot of cost that's not captured by these numbers, but it gives you a scale of how much you can end up paying as fines should the PRA find that your risk management principles and your risk management procedures and frameworks is not up to scratch. What is very interesting to note across all these firms is that governance, if you look into the reasons why these firms have been penalized, governance is a common theme. And again, just like risk management, governance again is a very intangible element. So if you ask yourself the question, what does good risk governance look like? You wouldn't find, necessarily any hard and fast principles in the CRR or in the PRA rule book that defines exactly what it is. What they would do is they would set principles, and it's down to the firms to interpret those principles in the context of the risks that it faces through its business model or its modus operandi. And it's important that the governance structures that the firm has in place reflects that risk, both on the quantitative front as well as the qualitative front. So governance is very, very important. And it's even more important because as it's probably going to come to light more when I go on to the next stage. So now perhaps it's worth looking at the thematic areas where there have been shortcomings, which has then led to the fines. So if you look at the matrix over here, there are 3 areas that have either 4 ticks, i.e. 1 tick across each of the firms, or 3 ticks, which is 3 out of the 4 have had that weakness. So looking at the first point, or the first horizontal layer where we can see 4 ticks is the one right at the top, which is culture and tone from the top does not support robust risk management. Now this loops back to what Gregory spoke about right at the start. The tone at the top is very, very important and very, very critical. So those working at the operational level within the second line or within the risk environment or ecosystem, it's very important for them to realize that there is a very clear and definitive focus on risk management that originates straight at the board, like right from the board level. And unless that culture and unless that discipline is there and it's translated and cascaded down through the ranks, it's very difficult for operational measures to hit the standards that the board or indeed the regulator expects of the firm. The second area where there are 4 ticks across each of the firms is the third from the last row that you can see over there, and that is controls insufficiently robust to prevent risk events. Now, the key word that jumps out of the paper in this instance is the word prevent. Now, as you know, controls can be preventive as well as detective. And there are many firms that I have seen and perhaps read as well from our experience. A lot of the focus is on detecting crystallized risk events or on detecting, where risk might have arisen in the past because of decisions that have already been taken. This is good. You need to have detective controls. You need to have a process to, perhaps bring the list together, look at it, retrospectively, and then put measures in place. But it's equally important to have processes in place that prevent particular risks from crystallizing. Now, having worked in the PRA in the past, there have been instances where supervisory teams have sat down with minutes of meetings from key decision-making frameworks and specifically looked out for where risk has contributed to key decisions. And unless the supervisory teams have seen such interventions from risk, they simply haven't been satisfied that risk plays key, critical, and meaningful role in how the firm operates and rolls out its business model. So it's very important that risk is involved at the decision-making phase, so that they have their inputs heard, they have their inputs noted, in order to prevent the risks, prevent the firm from operating at a level that's outside of the risk appetite. And lastly, it's worth looking at the strata that's right above the controls piece, and that is insufficient resource to undertake risk activities. So that particular theme has been common for 3 out of the 4 firms, and this is very much in line with the survey result that we saw earlier. That there is insufficient resource, but the key question here to ask yourselves, and the key question for firms to answer is, will additional resource cost as much as the fine? And I think the answer in most cases, would perhaps be a no. And it's therefore a question that's worth thinking about very, very closely and with a lot of, sincerity. Now, and Erica, if we move on to the next section, we'll be talking about, what does maturity look like, or what are the 4 stages of maturity that firms can achieve and do operate within. So on one end of the spectrum, you've got limited, which is not something we see very often. So this is where there is absolutely little or absolutely no risk management processes or structures that are in place, and it is very difficult to find firms that fall within that bucket, because if you're regulated, having a proper delineation between your 3 lines and having an effective risk function is one of the key areas that you must meet in order to get authorized, let alone carry on operating as a regulated firm. So it is very difficult to find firms that have a limited risk management, a limited amount of risk management process and structure in place. Where most firms are is foundational. So this is where some or standardized risk management principles do exist. They are defined and they are documented. So the policies are more or less there. But that's usually where it stops. What we often find is that these policies and procedures are not frequently updated. So, the risks that the business model is exposed to at one point in time is perhaps beyond what the policies and the procedures cover. We also sometimes find that the operational element of the firm going about its business doesn't often align with policy. So operationally, the firm is following one particular approach, despite the policy requiring you to follow something slightly different. So the 2 aren't always aligned. And that could be looked at in 2 ways. So one can argue that, yeah, the modus operandi is agile because the operational processes are, how should I put this? The operational processes are, responding to the changing environment and the changing business model. But then again, it exposes you to the risk of operating in a way that is not aligned or not within the firm's risk appetite, which presumably is what the risk management procedures and standards set in stone. So a lot of the firms that we see, be it small, medium, or large, find themselves in the foundational aspect, in the foundational bucket. Integrated is essentially the next step, and that is usually the target, where most firms would want to be in, and also a state of affairs that the PRA would be most comfortable with. So this is where, the weaknesses that I outlined in foundational don't exist. Everything is aligned, everything is updated. The policies and procedures are just as agile as operational, elements, and everything works in a very continuous improvement type, cycle where, identified, remediate, address, and then the cycle works pretty well. So that's integrated, and that's where, most firms should aim to be, and the PRA also, subjectively holds firms to those standards. Fully embedded, some firms are there, but to reach that stage, you have to perhaps do a cost benefit analysis. As you can see, to be in the fully embedded bucket, you need to have sophisticated and advanced risk management processes that are used for all major risk types. And, this would come at a cost to, design new systems, to implement new systems, to test new systems, and to train, your firm and your colleagues to use those systems effectively, so that it does give you the outputs and the results that you expect. So that usually involves a lot of cost, a lot of time, and if you feel that the benefit of implementing such a system, outweighs the cost investment, fair enough. You would really stand out in the market, but usually, there are very few firms that go for that option, and integrated is where they end up in. Now, having said that, it's perhaps time for our next poll. So our question to you is, with that background in mind, where do you think your firm currently sits on the ERM maturity scale? Is it limited? Is it foundational? Is it integrated, or do you feel it's fully embedded? So we'll allow a few seconds for you to respond to that. Okay. Precisely. So, so the vast majority of the firms are in foundational, and there is room in thinking about what steps can be taken to make that journey from foundational to integrated. Very keen to hear from the two respondents who have voted for fully embedded. It would be good to touch base at some point, but yes, thank you very much for that. Breda.
Thank you, India. Next slide, please. Yes, so I think, as India said, most firms, we would expect them to be at the foundational stage, and then we would expect firms aiming to achieve the integrated enterprise risk maturity stage. So I thought what we would do is we just look in a bit more detail about what does integrated look like. So we've broken this down into 5 dimensions. So we have risk strategy as the first. So all firms are going to be producing their 5-year business plan and their strategy on how they're going to achieve this. But at the integrated level, firms are discussing the risks and how these can be managed. How will you update your risk appetite metrics to align to what needs to be achieved in the strategy, and how often is this reviewed? With the governance, who has accountability and ownership of risk management within the firm, and how is that filtered through the business? And is this reviewed regularly when there is a significant change in the business? Culture, this is key. Without the right culture, the tone from the top and the tone from the middle, which is equally important, and communication to each employee, it will be very hard to embed effective risk management processes. At the integrated level, each employee should be aware of what they are accountable for, that every person in the firm is a risk manager for their own processes, and this should be assessed at performance meetings. The next dimension is process. So this will be regular reviews of risk registers and RCSAs, and there is appropriate ownership and independent challenge between the first line and the second line. And lastly, reporting. So at the integrated stage, we see firms have embedded technology to produce reports, and that the reports give a holistic overview of data to key management stakeholders. So in summary, the integrated stage will be ERM capabilities and practices that are well established in the culture and the formal process of the business. The ERM and the business unit risk management are standardized, coordinated, and promoted consistently. The risk information is increasingly taken into account in decision-making and resource allocation, particularly for higher risk areas, and also reflected in performance management processes. Next slide, please. So within the enterprise risk maturity assessment, there are some key steps for firms to reach that target state. So first of all, it's important for firms to understand where they sit. So what the target state is, but then equally as important, how they determine a plan to get from where they sit to where they want to be. So the first thing would be to conduct that maturity assessment. So that's going to provide the holistic overview we have mentioned earlier. So you need to look at your current state. What do you have in place? What is working and what is not? And also what has changed for the business internally and externally. So once the firm has assessed this and understands the gaps that they currently have, they can look to create the action plan. So the next stage at the action plan is where you would expect firms to ensure that decision makers are assigned and that you identify key dependencies that could impact the progress of the plan. One of the key things to consider is that this is not performed solely by risk management. This can be led by risk management, but it is really, really important to engage with the key stakeholders of the business. This will also ensure that there is a complete understanding and embedding of the enterprise risk management framework when it's put in place. And then the final stage is going to be executing and reviewing the plan. So this plan should be monitored on a regular basis to ensure that it's on track. Any bottlenecks are identified and remediated. Identify gaps from the maturity assessment stage should be monitored and reviewed in case they have changed against where the firm wants to be at the end stage. This exercise should be carried out on a regular basis. We would recommend that it is good practice to review your enterprise risk maturity state on an annual basis, or more often if there have been significant changes to the business. Next slide, please. So something that we have mentioned quite a bit. So all the dimensions need to be working together to be successful. And if we drill down to the key area, which is often overlooked and undervalued, it's risk culture. So what is risk culture? So it really is that glue that binds all the elements of risk management together, because it reflects the shared goals and the practices that embed risk into a business's decision-making processes and risk management into its operating processes. An effective risk culture enables and rewards individuals for taking the right risks in an informed manner. Values, behaviours and understanding that make up the way in which individuals and groups interact with and act on risk. And one thing that comes to mind here is, how do employees manage risk when no one is looking? This is where the strong risk culture needs to be in place. So as you can see on this slide, the culture incorporates that tone from the top, the accountability, incentives, communication and challenge, and review. So we often see gaps in these areas, and firms will often focus on the underlying systems and controls. However, even if these are fit for purpose, if they're not supported by a strong risk culture, firms will have difficulties adopting and embedding the processes and the ERM framework. A sound risk culture is going to provide that environment that is conducive to effective risk management. And all organisations need to take risks to achieve objectives, and the culture towards risk makes it better or worse at managing these risks. We've noticed that organisations within appropriate risk cultures will often find themselves allowing activities that are at odds with the stated appetite, the policies, procedures, or they're operating completely outside of policy, exposing the business to more risk. And then we talk about the communication and the reviews. So these are really key drivers for the sound risk culture. Firms need to acknowledge that mistakes can happen, but ongoing review and updates are necessary. And that dialogue and that discussion at all levels to foster that common understanding really promotes that knowledge sharing and that key risk management framework. Next slide, please. So some of the key areas for management to focus on are themes that we've themes that have gone through this webinar today. But some of the steps that you can take to enhance these areas, we'll look at each one individually. So the first one we've got is culture. So it's not an exact science, and that's why it's even more important to take the time to define what is meant and align your risk culture and the values to your business's risk appetite. So what is expected of individuals and what is expected of teams and heads of departments? Lead by example, as I said, walk the walk. So the board should define the risk culture of risk awareness and ethical behaviour for the entire organisation. Collective responsibility. So everyone has responsibility for acting in a manner which is consistent with its values and attitude towards risk. How? You could look at linking between HR, so performance management, and the risk appetite. Practice risk-aware objective setting and risk competency evaluation. Also, training is key and at different levels. So initial new joiner training, targeted training programs for individuals in that higher risk area, also for the risk-taking roles. So the risk champions, risk owners, lunch and learns. So it's key to support that learning and development associated with raising awareness and competence in managing risk at all levels. Communication, the next box. So regular communication on risk matters to employees at all times. There should be an internal communication plan, and that it's really important to identify how that risk awareness can be built and also sustained. So this implies making a conscious and sustained effort to make risk and risk management visible. So techniques for communicating on risk could include internal staff letters and magazines, intranet websites. There could be banners, posters, risk management week campaigns, competitions and awards. So there's many options, but it just needs to ensure that a communication is consistent throughout the firm and that any key changes to risk management are also communicated throughout the firm. The last area is review. So there should be a regular review of the policies and procedures, and firms should ensure they conduct that lessons learned and deep dive into the higher risk areas, because that really gives employees that time to reflect on what occurred and how they can ensure that it goes better for the next time. Firms can also look to hold regular anonymous staff surveys as well, and they can look to ensure that there is an improvement from if they do it on quarterly basis from one quarter to the next. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. So we hope there's been a few takeaways for everyone to think further about. But before we close, it would be good to run through any questions anyone might have at this time. So I will hand over to Gregory.
Thanks a lot, Breda and India, for the presentation. We indeed have a few questions. The first one is an organizational one. I forgot to mention the slide will be available at the end of the presentation, so we will send that to you. And the recording of the webinar will be on our website, so you can access it at a later stage. So we have a few questions. The first question is: we conduct RCSA once a year. Should this be more frequent?
Yes, so RCSA. So the they really have to be dependent on your business and your size, the business size and nature. Also the resources and the tools that you have available. Looking back at the initial survey that we did, resource constraints is obviously key. Now, it might not be a one size fits all. For example, an operations team could have more frequent changes to their processes than, let's say, a HR team. So you need to ensure proportionality is taken into account here. The key for the business is to decide how often you want to do an assessment of your department, the risks and controls, to ensure effective risk management is in place. If one of the issues is that resource constraints, then it's about planning. So it's really about planning that year ahead and how to use the resources that you have available in the most effective way.
Thank you, Brida. Second question, what are the common factors for recurring risk events?
So the common factors, I think it's really going back to that risk event management that we spoke about earlier. So it's at each stage. So I think with the risk event, if the root cause analysis is not done effectively, then it just leads to the same risk event reoccurring the next month or a similar risk event occurring. You can also see that the management actions, once you do the root cause analysis and then you discuss the management actions that you want to put in place, but then, for example, resource constraints, or perhaps there is a lack of awareness of the roles and responsibilities of who should be doing what, for some reason, they're not put in place. And then also that is not followed up by the business or by risk management. And again, that could all be put in place. And the next stage could be the controls. So you've done your root cause analysis, you've looked at the management actions, you've looked at the controls, you've put those controls in place, but then they're not reviewed. So if you don't review them on a regular basis, you can't ensure that it's got that continued effectiveness to then mitigate that risk event occurring again. Because one thing that we've also talked about is how the business can change, and there's so many factors that can impact that.
Thank you. I have a third question. So does this mean we should be investing more in risk management resources? I think it's linked to the poll as well.
Yeah, I think this is key, and especially as a lot of firms are talking about the lack of resources that are available. I think the key is holistically assessing what your target risk maturity level is, and you have to be realistic. We looked at the integrated and the foundational stage, but if you can't get to the integrated stage because of those gaps that you've assessed, then maybe foundational is where you would comfortably sit. So as long as you have made that analysis and you've assessed those gaps, you could then look at, right, these are the gaps and this is where we need those further resources. But you might need less, because the aim is that you want your processes to be made more efficient and automated where possible, to look to minimize those risks and those extra costs to the business. So having that holistic view, doing that piece of work at the beginning of that enterprise risk maturity assessment, seeing where your gaps are, actually could result in making roles more efficient, more automated, which could result in a reduction of resources.
Thank you. And I have a last question. So what are the key indicators of a harmful risk management culture?
So a risk management culture. So obviously we've spoken a lot about culture, which is key. I think that if you think about the risk events that are raised, I think this is a key indicator because people generally look at the more risk events that are raised, then that means that the culture might be good or might not be good depending on what the risk events are. But I think one thing that is good to look at is if none have been raised, because if people are not raising risk events, then there really isn't that open dialogue about what needs to be raised and how they raised it. And then that really impacts the mitigating the reoccurrences of those risk events, and also could result in larger risk events going forward. So if people are raising risk events, it means that there's training, it means there's systems and tools and resources for them to be raised. And that means a good risk culture. If they haven't been raised, that could be the opposite. Also about management information. So if that's not being challenged and the management information is being sent to the executive committee, but it's more a tick box exercise and there's no kind of challenge, there's no action being taken from the management information on the key risk to the business, this is an indication of a harmful risk management culture, because it then becomes complacent that you're just doing reporting for the sake of doing reporting rather than actually seeing what could be a trend towards a larger risk for the firm. And I think lastly would be around the risk data. So if there isn't that risk data available, so if you don't have that system in place or it's not reviewed frequently enough, then that can mean that it's not being communicated to the wider audience of the firm, and that can really be harmful for the risk management culture.
Great, thank you very much. That concludes our webinar. So thanks again, Breda and Anya, for the presentation. Thank you all very much for attending this webinar, and I hope to see you soon. Bye. Have a good afternoon.